Broadcasting live from the Newsmax studio in New York City, here is Steve Malzberg.
Our politicians should be thrown in the slammer for willful blindness. If we are in a position of being able to act, and we see something going on and we refuse to acknowledge the threat or act on it, we can be taken to court for willful blindness. I think that we are being willfully blind to the consequences for our children and grandchildren. It's an intergenerational crime.
All right, folks, the lunacy over so-called global warming. As a matter of fact, let's welcome in Dan Gainor, Vice President of Business and Culture at the Media Research Center. Hey, Dan.
Hey, how are you doing today?
You know, I'm well. You know, I was driving in and I was listening to a report on CBS local news radio, and they were talking about how it wasn't their report, but somebody's kidney stones apparently increase in frequency in the heat, and they tagged it with. Now that the Earth is warming at such a rapid rate, we could expect an increase in the number of people suffering from kidney stones. And I'm like, what are you talking about?
Well, you can chalk that up with all the other fun stuff they predicted, like increase hookers in one of the stories, and you know, that remember Miami's going to be 20 feet underwater probably by about now.
Oh, yeah, well, Al Gore had that predicted. The seas will rise. Yeah,
and of course the polar caps will melt, and they're not doing that. In fact,
it's reversed.
Antarctica is record ice, and you know, they send the ship down south to study the ice. So you know, basically they wanted to study climate change.
And they got stuck.
Yeah, they got stuck
in the ice.
Days, and they don't come to the conclusion that climate change might be cooling. No, they just bury it. That's all, because you know we can't.
The founder of Greenpeace is now talking about, if I'm not mistaken, that he fears a cooling trend, a global cooling trend. But let's talk about the media coverage. And you know, there was a poll that I mentioned yesterday. I referenced it. I think it was Quinnipiac poll that showed only 20% agree with the statement made by the president and others, and apparently the BBC, as we're going to talk about in a second, that the debate is over on so-called global warming and climate change. 60-some-odd% do not agree with that, but they don't care. They just keep putting it forth until they repeat it enough that they can change enough minds. So tell us what the BBC is now training their reporters to do.
Well, and for everybody who has any following of international media knows, the BBC is spun anti-American, left-wing, etc. But they've allowed some climate skeptics on their shows. So then they came out with the recommendation in 2012, and they updated that recommendation just recently, saying pretty much they don't have to worry about balance. They can just, you know, there are certain things that are just kind of facts on the ground. That's the way they are. And so they don't want to get caught up into, you know, trying to compromise and putting on people who don't meet those requirements. So in other words, there's only one opinion allowed on the BBC.
Right. I mean, it goes beyond censorship. I mean, it's even worse than just censorship. And you know, you don't have to go to the BBC. On CNN, the host of Reliable Sources, their media guy, Stelzer, he fairly recently, again, if I have my memory serves me correct, he said that there's really, you know, we're putting too many people on who there's really no debate. We shouldn't be giving the airtime to people who disagree with climate change.
Well, you look at the reactions from the media to what BBC did, and instead of, I mean, of course, you get the crazy loons at Salon and Huffington Post who love it because they don't think conservatives should actually ever be able to speak on any issue. You know, remember GLAAD's running around trying to get the networks to ban people who don't agree with gay marriage. So as hate group, SPLC calls people who don't agree with gay marriage hate groups. So this is fully in fitting with that. But when the Washington Post comes out and just says, oh, the people at the BBC were getting schooled in science reporting. No, they're getting schooled in propaganda, something the BBC has been good at for years. I guess that's why they didn't notice, you know, Jimmy Savile and all of his young friends.
Absolutely, and as far as the BBC goes, you know, they have openly shied away from skeptics of climate change or global warming for a long time. So now they're just going to eradicate it altogether. And this, look, you know, what's been driving me crazy lately, Dan, is the coverage of the Hamas-Israel war, which I call it. I can't find myself describing it any other way but a war. And this like meter, this count. Why don't the stations just put on and have it run constantly how many Palestinians are killed, and implying that Israel's overreacting, and put a score that no Israelis have been killed, and paint the Israelis as the big bad aggressors when it's their nation, their sovereign nation, that's under constant bombardment, and Israel needs to apologize for responding because nobody on their side's been killed yet.
Yeah, they need to apologize for winning. See, I'm old enough to remember when the American media liked Israel. I remember back in 1972 when the Olympic athletes were killed by Palestinian terrorists. I remember in 73, the war in 73, where Israel almost lost. I remember in Entebbe. And then the Palestinians kept losing, and they lost consistently, and the media like an underdog. So they've stopped even calling Hamas terrorists.
I know the Media Research Center did a study. It was out the other day. It might have changed by now, but 9-1, which I'm sure you're well aware, and I mentioned it earlier in the week. 9-1, the three networks call the Hamas terrorists militants or soldiers or whatever the heck they call them, but they won't call them terrorists.
Yeah, only one network that I've seen so far, CBS, has called them terrorists, and even then, their reporter does this real cool dodge where she says, well, Israelis saying they're striking terrorists, but the Hamas militants, and so they love calling them militants. No, they're not militants. They've taken in the last 10 years 8,000 rockets and fired them into Israel indiscriminately, trying to hit men, women, and children. And then they get upset when they basically start a war, and Israel is able to prosecute that war better than they are. So Israel goes around and starts killing their officers. And these Hamas monsters hide behind women and children. And so then the Arabs and, of course, the American media get upset that, well, women and children are getting killed. Well, of course, if we allowed back in World War II, if we allowed the Nazis to have hidden behind children,
not only that, Dan,
fight the war.
Dan, if we didn't bomb cities, if cities were Berlin, if we didn't bomb cities in World War II, we would have lost as well. Now, God forbid, you can't. If a civilian dies, and not, I mean. Please, it's too aggravating to even go there. But I'll say this, when Jews die, then the media all of a sudden likes Israel and feels sorry. But that's very short-lived. Dan, thank you very much. Great to talk to you.
Thanks. Have a great day.
You too. Dan Gainor, ladies and gentlemen. And we're coming back with more. And you get a little bit of me alone in the next segment. And it's coming up right here on the Steve Malzberg Show on Newsmax Television.